Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? I don't have a lapel mic, but seems fine. Okay, great. Okay, thank you for having me today. I'm Simone. I was told not to introduce myself, so I won't say any more, I'll stick to the rules. Today I'll be talking about making AI work for global research integrity. So I will say I am the lead author of this white paper released by Frontiers on AI's untapped potential. This was shared in the AI workshop yesterday, so I know some of you have read it already. If you haven't had a chance to, you can scan the QR code here for access. Some of the findings I'll discuss today were part of the online survey that contributed to this white paper, so that can be found there. And generally there's just quite a lot that I wanted to say today, and some of the background is in there, and there's good stuff, so check it out. So before I get into the data, I'll give some background. So this was an online survey where we asked researchers across multiple global regions, disciplines, and seniorities questions around AI use. It was conducted with an aim that we wanted to understand the behaviors and the perceptions driving that AI use. So the questions were designed to reveal that kind of sentiment. We asked questions like, what causes mistrust and fear or excitement around AI? What causes them to want to explore or innovate or try new things or get creative? Where do they look for best practice? And what behaviors are they seeing from their peers? Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Sorry, my speaker notes just disappeared. Essentially, the key point here is that we want to make sure that any governance and policy that we're rolling out is making sure that it's meeting the needs of those human behaviors and the things that make sure that they work. So behavior doesn't automatically follow policy, and we know that behavior is not static, it changes over time. So systems fail if we don't account for that. So let's take a look at who responded to our survey. We had 1,645 respondents, and looking at the global distributions, we can see that Europe, Asia, North America were strongly represented. We also heard from regions across Africa, China, Latin America, and the broader APAC region. But while this is a broad global sample, some regions do remain underrepresented, so we can see it's classically weighted towards Europe and North America. Another key limitation is that this was an online survey, so we did not yet conduct any conscious effort to reach regions that have limited internet access. And that's a massive part of the global challenge and the global conversation, and those regions will face different challenges and different motivations around AI. But we see this as the beginning of an ongoing global challenge, not a closed data set. So this is something essentially that we'll be looking into in the future. So on to the findings then. Despite that emphasis I just started with talking about behaviors in my first slide, we did start where most AI surveys have started. I know there's a few of them out there. We asked who's using AI in the research process at all. And we see a confirmatory finding here. So many other AI surveys point to a rough figure of 77 to 80% currently using AI in the research process. And we see that this number is increasing, so we asked them over the past 12 months, has that increased? And 53% said yes. And then looking at specifically peer review, we have 23% said in peer review it's even increased, and I know that's an area that sometimes we are a bit more hesitant about AI being used. There's some skepticism there. But the message I'd like us to take away from here is that I would like us to retire the sentiments that AI is an emerging technology. And I think this is important because sometimes if we're thinking about AI still emerging or still coming up, we have this comfort feeling that we still have time to discuss things like the right governance and the right regulation. And that's an unconscious feeling, but I do think it contributes to what we were speaking about yesterday, Keith, who was mentioning scenario planning, and how AI in this scenario 3 is kind of moving towards that laissez-faire attitude and kind of all the dystopian things that come with that. I think this is something that also contributes to that. So even with such high adoption, we do see that surface use dominates. So the top use is still improving grammar, formatting, and language polishing. If you have already read the white paper, you'll know that's something that we see as something to address in itself, because one of the analogies my CEO used is like it's having a Ferrari and only using it to go to Lidl. Nothing against Lidl, I'm a big fan. But we could be using AI to do so much more. There are opportunities to enhance reproducibility. There's ways we can use it to enhance statistical analyses, improve representation and bias. I know we've mentioned that a lot this week, or yesterday. So there are things that can really enhance scientific quality. But the thing that's really interesting here is that we are seeing people starting to explore using those in those higher impact areas, and they do carry higher risk. So we see 20% here starting to use it for methodologies, 22% are exploring it in statistical analysis and interpretation of findings, which is, kind of a judgment-based area that we've been kind of skeptical about before. And so when we're talking about support and governance, we need to cover those critical areas as well. And if this adoption trajectory continues for these different use cases as well, we need to collectively acknowledge that AI is not just being used for manuscript drafting. And we won't be able to confine it to that for long. This data was from 6 months ago. I'm sure that's already increased. So I promised some discussion of the global variances as well. So we do see this pattern of high adoption globally, but it does vary by region. So if we look at people who reported that they're using AI always, often, or at least rarely, we see that China leads in adoption with 91% using AI tools, followed closely by Asia and Africa with 88% and 87% respectively. Then at the bottom, we see Europe's lag slightly, and North America has a bigger gap than we expected, with about dropping to 55%. So it's not confined to one geography, we know that, it's everywhere, but it is interesting that across all regions we saw sometimes was the top answer, so people are sometimes using AI, except North America, where never was the most common answer. And we see that similar regional pattern for AI use when looking specifically at peer review. So that was something that at the time people were more hesitant about. And it's something that we've brought to our minds more recently. But adoption is progressively becoming the norm in peer review as well. So we have China, again, highest with 77%, Africa 66%, and then usage dropping in other regions with only 31% in North America. In North America, 69% of people reported never using it for peer review, and 54% reported never using it for peer review in Europe. We also see that optimism around AI is not evenly distributed. So yesterday we heard a great debate about whether AI will yield a net benefit for humanity. We asked some similar questions to try and understand the same, if there's optimism there. So we asked, do you feel AI offers opportunities to promote greater equity and inclusion? So we were just asking about if there's opportunities, not even if it would save humanity. And researchers in China, Asia, and the Americas are most optimistic about AI promoting greater equity and inclusion. But that confidence drops when you're looking just at Europe, and in North America it's just 22%. And if you look at the red bars on the side here, you can see that the people that strongly disagreed with that statement, so felt kind of the opposite, 28% of North America were most skeptical. So we did analyze the free text boxes to understand a bit more about those sentiments, and we do see that the narrative around AI is slightly different in these regions. So we did expect that in regions where English is not your first native language, or where they experience more barriers to getting published, that they might have already turned to AI earlier than others because they're out of necessity, essentially. So that wasn't surprising that we saw comments that AI can be seen as a great tool for inclusion, reducing human biases, being hopeful that they're more objective than some of the humans in the process, particularly editors, so we saw that mentioned. But in the Western regions, we saw much more moral discussion and a much more moral lens around the choices not to use AI. So there was more mention that AI is a stealer of people's work, a stronger focus on social justice and equity in academia, and more respondents raised sensitivity to things like algorithm biases, unequal access, and that longer-term future risk. So even when they see these productivity benefits, they are still hesitant to use AI for those reasons. And I think this is really important, and I'll come back to this point later, that when we're looking at things like support and how we can move the needle in some of these areas, it will be important to consider how the regions you're looking at have different views and how that can help uptake of certain support efforts and governance. So this slide may seem somewhat tangential, but I do think it's also an interesting piece of data. So we asked reviewers how they perceive AI when they encounter it in a paper. So we asked them to look back or recall the last time they reviewed a paper where they noticed that the authors had used AI. And basically there's mixed reviews. So 63% did say that the AI enhanced the overall quality of the paper. But then they also felt that it made them doubt the work's integrity, the author's integrity or the integrity of the work. And it didn't increase credibility, so only 27% said they felt like it boosted credibility. And that's important because AI-assisted work still needs to be credible, especially if it's embedded in the research workflow, if we're using it in all parts of the cycle. And reviewers are thinking, it's a bit dodgy or they're not trusting that work. These reviewers are also active researchers, so that's very telling as well. That could inform whether they're willing to disclose if they've used AI. In all regions, concern about misuse was very high. So 71% said that they were worried about misuse by themselves or others. 53% responded that they had actually observed what they considered to be misuse of AI by their peers or by a research group that they were aware of. So we intentionally didn't define what misuse meant here because we wanted to capture that uncertainty or ambiguity rather than anchor people to our definition of what counts as misuse. There were things that they did highlight in the free text boxes that I've put there. But the point is, it's not immediately obvious to everyone what counts as misuse or misconduct. And when I've presented this data point before, the first question I get asked is, well, what did you mean by misuse? And it's not immediately obvious. So without those thresholds being defined, that uncertainty rises and that suspicion fills the gap. The most obvious thing then, if you're an author or a researcher worried about accidentally misusing AI or your peers misusing AI, is that you might look for guidance or support. So we asked them, where are you turning to for help? What researchers have helped you recently? Can you point us to any that are useful? We wanted to know what was out there. And the majority couldn't name any known resource to support them with AI. 35% of researchers are entirely self-taught. When I asked what that meant, they were mostly just using AI to teach them how to use AI and asking it questions. 31% turned to their institutions, but when I did the follow-up interviews, the institutions haven't actually provided anything specific. They would assume that if there were certain rules around AI, that their institutions would give it to them. 16% rely on publishers, and 18% take no action at all to ensure best practice. So the key message here is that researchers are really left alone when they're trying to navigate these powerful tools. And something I really took away from yesterday's debate is that we can't necessarily wait for intervention, for government support or regulation to enforce some of these things. We really have to take matters into our own hands and do something to support these researchers. And I think if you're from an institution today, 31% relying on institutions, that should be a great motivator for you to support those researchers within your organization. Even publishers in the room, 16%, that may sound small, but it does point to a need for you to provide those resources and be able to move the needle in things like AI literacy. Researchers are the human in the loop, and so we need to teach them how to be that. And they're calling for it. 20% of people cited a lack of guidance or unclear rules as their top barrier to responsible AI use. So this quote from a respondent I really think exemplifies the problem globally. And so if I could choose one take-home argument for today, it would be that AI literacy is the next critical step in the process. And with my next slides, I will hope to convince you all that this is possibly the most actionable part of this problem today. And it's actionable because it's very much within our power to deliver some of these things. If you're a member of an institution or an educator, here's what you need to be doing. Embed AI literacy into your curriculum, or share this as a call to action within your organization. I want to see them developing core modular programs, and then, kind of to Nikesh's point as well, tracking and publishing the uptake of people that are having those. If you're a funder, one, join the conversation, because I often see funders are missing from some of these conferences and some of these conversations. Fund equitable access in tools, because literacy, as Nikesh mentioned, you need to be able to use the tools to learn them. You need to have some access. Fund those training programs. Fund research coming from organizations that are delivering these training programs. If you're a publisher, provide guidance, and I'm talking a bit more in-depth guidance than just the policy work, because as we've seen in the workshop, some of those policy pages are not fit for purpose. They're not giving the background information that the researchers need. And lastly, if you're a tool provider, make sure your tools are accessible so everyone can learn by doing, as I said, but also provide the information to support informed choices. Part of AI literacy is being able to choose the tools that fit your morals, that fit your values, that you're able to audit and you can find that information. And when I was coming up with some best practices around what that is, when I looked at the main tools, none of them really provide that. I didn't fit it on this slide because I've been told never do more than 4 points on a slide or you have too many, but researchers, obviously, if you're in the room, do the training when it appears. Now, I wanted to make sure I'm progressing the conversation from things that are just theoretical to some practical takeaways. And when I did some follow-up interviews with respondents of the survey, that's speaking to them one-on-one, I spoke to AI experts, I spoke to some tool builders, I spoke to some professors of artificial intelligence, I spoke to AI skeptics, I spoke to people that are very excited and already exploring with multiple AI tools. And these were the things that they wanted to see or that came out of our conversation that should be included in a curriculum on AI literacy. Firstly, how to choose the right tools. So we know that tools are not all built the same. Specific tools for specific contexts are often the safest. So if you're using a tool specifically for peer review or specifically for statistical analysis, you need to make sure that they have that capability. And that's something that people aren't taught currently, how to even assess or what to look for. Safe and advanced prompting is another one. So this is often the first line defense against things like hallucination and errors. And again, this isn't something that many people are taught. They want to know how to apply AI and use AI in specific research workflows. So they want to know, how can I use it in idea creation, or how can I use it in methodology planning? And really practical guidance on that. They want to know what actually is human oversight. So quite often this human in the loop narrative is not giving them any confidence. So that would cover things like keeping good records, being traceable, being reproducible. And a couple that I've added myself, mostly from our conversations here and from going and talking to some people, is that I think it's really important that we include staying informed, being informed of things like the conversations that we have here and the things that Nikesh is saying. Things like injustices. We would do that when we were teaching about medicine. We would talk about historical biases and historical risks or challenges, and I think that's something that should be built into these programs. Risks and mitigations to those risks kind of falls hand in hand with that, and advocating for change is something that I would really like to see included in these programs. Sorry, I didn't mention consequences as well as something that they were very concerned about. What happens if I haven't used AI properly? That's something that they wanted to know, what counts as misuse, what counts as misconduct, and what would happen if someone in my researcher group had used AI. So if that sounds a little bit abstract and possibly a little bit rushed, that list, I didn't really know how to fit all that information on that slide in a way that was super engaging. But at Frontiers, we have started to sort of come up with this AI playbook. That's a working title. I don't know if anyone's tried to name a document with AI, everyone having access to AI recently, but everyone comes up with 100 different titles and everyone argues about it. So that might change. But essentially, we're going live hopefully next month with a resource that covers those areas. And we're happy for it to be used as kind of a bouncing off point with proper attribution. And it's something that we want to be part of community feedback. So we want the users to actually give us that feedback. It will be iterative. It will be something that changes with the needs of the landscape. And if you do plan to do your part to support AI literacy efforts, please recall my earlier point to consider the global contexts, and it will help your programs to become more successful. So if you're working in a low access region, we've spoken about it a lot, but we want to have programs that enable safe participation. If you're working in a region with time pressures or high pressure to publish, it's probably best to design your training for efficiency to increase uptake. And if you're working in some of these trust-first regions where there's high AI skepticism, make sure you're talking about the opportunities to mitigate risks and ensure equity. So I added this slide last minute because a couple of you were grabbing me to ask about Frontier's AI Review Assistant. And this is kind of part of us trying to meet that need of an accessible tool. So it's kind of, this is I don't know if any of you might not know, but Frontiers have had AIRA, which is our AI Review Assistant, which has been leveraged for mostly integrity detection up until now, but we've just launched this peer review support tool for reviewers. And it's essentially a chatbot where they can ask questions about how to improve their review. But the purpose was to kind of ensure that we have a closed, a safe, and accessible tool to support researchers that might be turning to use AI in the review process. One of the researchers that I was talking to, when I asked how he used these mainstream tools, is he essentially just puts the peer review into one of these tools, and his version of human validation was to put it in just another tool, to Gemini, and then just upload the response. So that was part of the motivation why we wanted to provide a tool that we can actually see how people are using it, we can see what questions they're asking, we can see what it's spitting back out, and so we're able to govern that in a bit of a safer way. And we share and monitor that feedback as well. So I'd like to end by acknowledging that we kind of ended on a more pessimistic note yesterday with the debate, that we felt that we may not reach our AI utopia in time if we don't have governance or we're not able to act quickly enough. But I would like to share my favorite quote, which is, "A single grain of rice can tip the scale. One man may be the difference between victory and defeat." Show of hands if anyone knows where that quote is from. It is the Emperor from Disney's Mulan. So if I could leave that with you to, if you can, be the grain of rice in the scale and support AI literacy efforts, and be the people that are able to move the needle on teaching AI skills and supporting AI use, as the Emperor would have wanted. Thank you.